Thank you, Anna. Thank you, the whole department, for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm looking forward these couple of days of discussion on public philosophy. So my talk today is about public philosophy as metacognitive practice, pedagogical, epistemic, and ethical implications. In recent decades, and especially over the past 10 years, we have witnessed an extraordinary proliferation of philosophy in both the real world and online. Today, there are initiatives aimed at making philosophy accessible to everyone, from kindergartens to the elderly and everywhere, like schools, libraries, public squares, cafes, but also less conventional places like prisons, hospitals, and nursing homes. Additionally, there is a thriving production of philosophical content available to the public anytime and anywhere, including podcasts, TV shows, radio programs, videos, and of course, magazines and books. A recent effort to describe and analyze this phenomenon, I'm referring to A Companion to Public Philosophy, edited by Lee McIntyre, Jan Yolasov, and Nancy McCall in 2022, brought together over 14 contributions from an even larger number of authors, highlighting a remarkable diversity of formats and experiences under the common label of public philosophy. This leads to the pressing question, the hard problem for us gathered here today, which is, what is public philosophy? In other words, what, if anything, unites a podcast, a philosophy session for children, or a specialized magazine, allowing them all to be considered part of the same domain of public philosophy? The quick and the simple answer is that all these initiatives share the goal of bringing professional philosophers together with non-professional. However, while it is true that public philosophy is designed for non-experts, this description alone is both too broad and too vague to fully capture its essence and objectives. What this type of definition overlooks is the essence of public philosophy, its specificity compared to the other forms of interaction between experts and public. Simply bringing a professional philosopher and non-experts together in a physical or in a virtual space does not automatically constitute public philosophy. Not every encounter between professional philosopher and an audience qualifies as it. Not every seminar, post, or blog online can be considered public philosophy. There is something in the nature of the relationship between the expert and the public and the audience that defines public philosophy. The challenge for us interested in understanding public philosophy is to define this something. This is a challenge I have embraced, leading me to develop some conviction that I would like to share with you today. First, I believe that to understand what public philosophy is and the reasons behind its sudden explosion, we must examine the meta-philosophical framework that underpins and guides it. Despite the variety and complexity of the phenomenon, there is a specific underlying idea that unites all these practices, one that lies in the very conception of philosophy they assume. This idea of philosophy is sometimes explicitly stated and other times left implicit, but it can be deduced from how public philosophers promote and practice philosophy. I will reconstruct this idea in the first part of my talk. Secondly, I believe that this particular understanding of public philosophy gives rise to a series of significant outcomes, both for the individuals involved and for the discipline itself. I will address this in the second part of my talk. So, beginning with which idea of philosophy is behind this movement of public philosophy. Starting with the metaphilosophical framework that underpins this phenomenon, we must examine how public philosophers propose philosophy in order to address the broader question, how do they conceive of philosophy? Identifying a common methodological framework across the diverse initiatives is a challenging endeavor. As previously stated, public philosophy encompasses an expansive and a varied movement. Nevertheless, a shared approach seems to underpin this diversity. A significant aspect acknowledged by most public philosophers is namely their understanding of the relationship between them and the public. Rather than positing themselves as experts, delivering pre-packaged informational content, public philosophers strive to invite their audience into a collaborative exercise of philosophical thinking. This recalls the ancient notion of philosophy as synphilosophizing, co-philosophizing in English, a practice of thinking with and through the others, Miteinanderdenken in German, as exemplified by Socrates and later theorized by Plato and Aristotle. This conception of philosophy was explicitly embraced by the 20th century movement of philosophical practices and continues to influence contemporary public philosophy. Examples of such practices include philosophy for children, philosophy for community, for prisoners, and walks in nature, all this kind of movement. Café philo. Despite their diversity, these practices share a common understanding of philosophy as a collective search for knowledge, achieved through dialogic confrontation. Socrates is often cited as the archetypal figure of this approach, and many of these practices aim to recreate the Socratic dialogue, albeit in its various interpretations with their audiences. For instance, Peter Worley, in his book significantly entitled Corrupting Youth of 2021, introduced the philosophy of inquiry, which is a practice rooted in philosophy for children movement and designed for both youth and adults, as follows. I quote from Peter Worley: "In line with Socrates, its emphasis is very much on the activity of doing philosophy and doing so with others." End of quotation. By seeking co-philosophizing, the professional philosophers want to avoid a vertical relationship between the expert and the public. In fact, the very notion of public is challenged by public philosophy. The public, whether children, prisoners, elderly, or any other group of citizens, is not conceived as an audience, a passive recipient of truth, but rather as an interlocutor. This is an aspect that most public philosophers today acknowledge, regardless of the specific approach they take. So they refer to their public as, and I'm quote here, active participant, or a collaborator, or even an equal participant in the process of searching for truth. I do believe that this understanding of the public as directly involved in the process of philosophical inquiry applies not only to philosophers who organize live initiatives involving real-time interaction, but also to those who create content such as magazine articles, podcasts, videos, and other media that may not seem to engage the public in direct dialogue, at least not in real time. The distinction "not in real time" is significant though. Even in these cases, where philosopher and audience do not share the same space and time, public philosophers aim to invite their audience into a philosophical dialogue, fostering a collective activity of thinking. What then does it mean for a reader of an article or a listener of a podcast to be active participant in philosophical work? It means that despite the absence of real-time interaction, the public is encouraged to engage in philosophical inquiry independently, at their own space and in their own context. When engaging with the general public, professional philosophers do not merely disseminate the results of their research or simplify the latest academic developments. Instead, Even when created content for independent consumption, public philosophers aim to present the process behind their conclusions, guiding the audience to retrace and rethink the philosophical journey. Jack Russell Weinstein captures this idea succinctly, in my opinion. He says, "My first rules of public philosophy then is, let them see you think." So by demonstrating the process of thought, presenting the problems that spark inquiry, the reasoning behind, and even the unresolved issues, public philosophers invite their audience to reflect and think for themselves. In this way, the public is conceived as a partner in thought, even in the absence of real-time interaction. Public philosophy initiatives, therefore, serves as an invitation or a provocation to think. T. Meehan, in a manifesto for public philosophy, asserts that public philosophy is about beginning a conversation. This remains true even when the conversation initiated by public philosophy continues with an individual's own mind. Once again, we can turn to Plato's Socrates as progenitor of this conception of philosophical thinking, as both a dialogue with others and with oneself. In the Theaetetus, Plato famously defines thinking as dialogue of the souls with itself. So public philosophy seeks to create opportunities for engaging in philosophy together, where together can mean either one with the other, sharing the same time and space, or one through the other, an internal dialogue sparked by the philosopher's stimulus, such as a podcast, an article, a video. This brings us to the final consideration about how public philosophers approach their work. What defines an initiative as public philosophy is not the medium employed, be it an in-person dialogue group, an online blog, a radio program, but rather an underlying conception of knowledge and the purpose driving the effort. Not every seminar, public event, or online post is public philosophy, in my opinion. This distinction hinges on whether the initiative genuinely seeks to engage the public in philosophical inquiry. Ultimately, it is the purpose, the end, or the goal that defines an endeavor as public philosophy. And, as I argue, the primary aim of public philosophy is to provoke and engage the public in the activity of philosophical thinking. So if my analysis of the purpose of public philosophy is correct, we must then ask, why is this so? What metaphilosophical foundation supports the vision of philosophy as a collective practice, one that calls the public to active participation? This question will guide the next stage of my exploration. So philosophy as metacognitive inquiry into meaning. I have come to the conviction that what justifies the phenomenon of public philosophy in all its diverse forms is the recognition of philosophy's inherent metacognitive dimension. A dimension that profoundly influences how philosophy can be taught and disseminated, and ultimately explains why public philosophers do what they do. According to a widely shared understanding, philosophy operates by questioning, testing, and ultimately refining the ways we perceive and understand reality and ourselves. It is an activity dedicated not only to comprehending the world, but also to investigating how we come to see the world as we do, what gives rise to a belief, a conviction, a theory, what justifies it, what presuppositions underpin it, and what implications it carries. Philosophy engaged with our structures of meaning, concept, categories, and narratives, and ultimately with our knowledge as a whole. As Kant observes in his Prolegomena to any future metaphysics, rather than focusing on the production of new objects, as is typical in the natural science, for instance, philosophy seeks to clarify and deepen our understanding of what is already known, but not yet fully recognized or acknowledged. Similarly, in recent time, Thomas Nagel, in his What Does It All Mean? A very short introduction to philosophy, writes, I quote, "The main concern of philosophy is to question and understand common ideas that all of us use every day without thinking about them." End of quote. So in this sense, philosophy is the practice of interrogating and illuminating the ideas that shape our understanding of the world. This is an unending endeavor, as reality continuously confronts us with new questions of meaning, and our narratives demand constant maintenance and revision. Understood in this way, philosophy is both a work of conceptual clarification, addressing the "what does it mean" question, and a work of conceptual justification, dealing with the "why do we conceive in this way" question, or what justifies one conception over another of the same subject. So philosophy can provide a positive understanding of how we assign meaning to the world, and on the other hand, it can also provide a critical yet equally essential role in revealing the limits of our knowledge by shedding light on what still eludes our comprehension or remains insufficiently explored. Thus, a philosophical knowledge is always also a form of self-understanding for the subject. Herein lies the distinctly metacognitive dimension inherent to philosophy, a dimension that sets philosophy apart from other disciplines. To this metacognitive function, the essentially practical nature of philosophy is linked, with important consequences on the way we engage in philosophical inquiry, and we teach, we disseminate, we promote it. As the discipline dedicated to the examination and clarification of our structures of thought, philosophy cannot be reduced to a mere message or a set of content delivered by an expert. Rather, it is a self-reflective activity that anyone who seeks to learn philosophy must actively undertake. Kant's famous distinction between learning to philosophize and learning a philosophy comes here in mind, of course. For Kant, philosophy is not about passively acquiring a body of doctrines, but about engaging in an exercise of thought that turns inward to examine itself. To truly do philosophy, one must participate in this active self-reflective inquiry. This perspective emphasizes that philosophy is fundamentally a practice, and as such can only be effectively shared by inviting others to actively participate in it, for philosophy demands to be practiced in the first person. It is this metaphilosophical framework, I believe, that explains and legitimizes why public philosophers approach philosophy as they do, and justifies the definition of public philosophy I suggest, which is public philosophy is the philosophical practice devoted to provoking and promoting philosophical thinking in everyone interested in order to help them achieve a better understanding of themselves and the reality they inhabit. So, allow me to share some personal examples to illustrate what does it mean for a public philosopher to inviting non-professionals to engage in philosophy. I have facilitated philosophical workshops with people of various ages, from kindergarten children to the elderly, from diverse life circumstances, including both free citizens and prisoners. And here what typically happens in these activities. In a workshop with primary school children on the topic of happiness, for instance, The group initially expressed an understanding of happiness as instant pleasure. The joy of eating an ice cream, playing a game, and many other examples the children provided. However, as the dialogue unfolded, the children began to critically examine these initial hypotheses. They recognized that pleasure depends not only on the object itself, how tasty the ice cream is, how funny the game, but also on the subject's desire for it. Or, for example, they acknowledged that habituation could diminish pleasure and consequently happiness. As the discussion progressed, their understanding became increasingly refined. For example, they realized that how a desire is fulfilled or a goal is achieved matters for happiness, as they unanimously agreed that a victory or a school good grade obtained through cheating does not bring the same happiness as the satisfaction of having genuinely earned it. So, through the activity of co-philosophizing, the children moved beyond their initial immediate conception of happiness and developed a deeper, more sophisticated understanding of it. A similar process unfolded in a workshop with a group of prisoners. Their initial understanding of happiness was having everything one could possibly desire. This understanding was challenged and refined through the discussion. Some members of the group expressed dissatisfaction with this definition and suggested instead that happiness could be understood as a state of inner peace and contentment with what one has in the present moment, even while recognizing the potential for having much more under different circumstances, including physical freedom for them. Under this interpretation, they argued even a prisoner could find happiness. Not everyone agreed with this proposal, though agreement is not necessarily the goal of philosophy. But the inquiry allowed the group to uncover and articulate the diverse understandings of happiness they had. To offer a third and last example, a philosophical inquiry conducted with a group of individuals over 80 years old, 90 years old, as part of a public philosophy initiative in a healthcare residence, revealed another dimension of happiness. These participants agreed that happiness is not something we experience in isolation. They observed that happiness often arises in connection with others and at times even for the sake of others. Ultimately, these ladies and gentlemen recognized that happiness is deeply relational. So the intuition expressed by children, prisoners, and the elderly, in these intuitions, a professional philosopher can easily discern fragments of philosophical theories on happiness, ideas that have been articulated in much more coherent and systematic ways by Aristotle, Epicurus, Kant, Nozick, and many others. This might lead one to question the value of asking people without any philosophical training to reflect on concepts such as happiness or truth or justice. After all, couldn't we arrive at a deeper and a more sophisticated analysis in less time by consulting the history of philosophy or simply asking an expert philosopher? Yet, this objection entirely misses the point of public philosophy. As previously acknowledged, the aim of public philosophy is to provoke and cultivate philosophical thinking in anyone willing to engage, helping them develop a deeper understanding of themselves and the world they inhabit. This is public philosophy's true purpose. By encouraging people to question their immediate beliefs, uncover hidden assumptions, and explore possible implications, I like to think that the groups of children, prisoners, and elderly individuals mentioned before have genuinely experienced philosophical thinking. They have engaged in an exercise of meaning-making and meaning problematization that, however imperfect, it might have been, remains profoundly valuable. The invitation extended to the general public to engage in philosophical dialogue with professionals is not, in my view, driven by populist consideration or the academic's need for societal recognition, although such factors might play a role in current landscape. But rather, it is justified by the conviction that philosophy cannot be authentically practiced in any other way. The Socratic note to self, the metacognitive outcome of philosophy, is thus placed at the core of public philosophy mission. It serves not only as a methodological guiding principle, but also as a framework for legitimizing its purpose. So, I'm now come to the second part, the implications of this understanding of public philosophy. Having explored how and why public philosophers engage in their work, I now want to address the main implications of this practice. What can we expect from public philosophy so understood? I maintain that public philosophy aims to produce, first and foremost, a pedagogical impact, which in turn leads to an epistemic outcome. Together, both the pedagogical and the epistemic outcomes of public philosophy carry ethical and political significance, which I believe ultimately drives and motivates public philosophers. The pedagogical outcome of public philosophy. Understood as an open and inclusive invitation to engage in philosophical inquiry, public philosophy serves fundamentally as a form of public education in the practice of philosophy itself. This perspective invites us to view public philosophy as a form of paideia. Once again, Socrates emerges as the figure most frequently invoked as an ideal model of philosophical paideia. A philosopher who practiced philosophy by teaching it and who taught philosophy by practicing it with his interlocutors. Like Socrates, public philosophy is less about transmitting information or sharing results of others' research and more about educating individuals and fostering a specific forma mentis. This pedagogical model has seen varying levels of acceptance throughout the history of philosophy. We have already referenced to Kant and Kant's word on the importance of teaching the ability to philosophize. Similarly, Hegel reminds us that one can learn philosophy only by doing it, by rethinking what others have already thought and understood. I quote Hegel, "As much as philosophical study is in and for itself self-activity, to that degree also it is learning." End of quote. So according to this line of thought, there cannot be authentic teaching of philosophy without actively engaging students in the practice of philosophy itself. More recently, George Yancey, in his contribution to A Companion to Public Philosophy, argued that the very nature of the discipline requires it to be taught and shared in this manner, indeed only in this manner. This is why, according to him, the very distinction between teaching philosophy and practicing public philosophy dissolves. Philosophy taught in the classroom is by its nature a form of public philosophy, while public philosophy inherently functions as a form of philosophical education. Considering the educational purpose of what ultimately defines the phenomenon of public philosophy as a whole, allows us to account for the multifaceted landscape of public philosophy formats and initiatives. A diversity of approaches that mirror the various ways in which Socrates himself has been presented in his role as a teacher, At times, Socrates acts as a gadfly, provoking critical thought, and at other times, serving as a companion in a shared journey of inquiry. So similarly, a public philosopher today might choose to deliver thought-provoking content intending to sting the audience and stimulate reflection through a paper, a podcast, a video. At other times, the philosopher might opt for a more interactive approach, personally engaging the public and guiding them into a collaborative inquiry conduced in real time, as seen in practices like Café Philo, Philosophy for Community, Philosophy for Chile. In all these varied contexts and formats, when public philosophy succeeds, the audience is both formed and transformed by the philosophical activity. Individuals undergo transformation because they are enabled to see, often for the first time, aspects of themselves or of the reality that they had previously gone unrecognized. At a deeper level, they develop the capacity to independently carry out this process of analysis and problematization of their own structures of meaning. At the heart of philosophy, of public philosophy, lies the belief that philosophy, as the self-reflexive activity of questioning how we make sense of the world, is something that everyone can, or perhaps even must, undertake. But this is not because everyone is a natural philosopher. On the contrary, philosophical thinking demands effort, demands method and practice. Like any other discipline, philosophy has developed its own techniques and procedure and language essential to its practice. And public philosophy, as I understand and promote it, does not want to trivialize or to simplify the discipline to make it accessible to the public. Rather, public philosophy arises from the recognition that everyone may feel the need for philosophy, the need to make sense of their reality and critically reflect on how they understand it. In my view, it is precisely because public philosophers acknowledge both the rigor required for philosophical thinking and its ability to meet a deeply human need that they commit themselves to creating opportunities for everyone in any possible environment to engage in philosophical inquiry. This educational mission holds value not only for society, but also for the discipline itself. It affirms that the timeless idea that for no age is too early or too late for the health of the soul. I'm referring to Epicurus, of course. In other words, it is never too early or too late to learn philosophy. I have personally witnessed numerous instances of the pedagogical and transformative effects of public philosophy. I will share one particularly striking example here today with you. After a series of philosophical workshops in prison, one of the inmates, let's call him Masad, it's not his real name, wrote to me in a letter, and I quote, "Last week I met with the lawyers who proposed alternative measures to prison. My initial reaction wasn't to agree immediately. Instead, I decided to think carefully, first evaluating all the risks I might face. I only approached this decision in this way thanks to the philosophy class, which I hadn't initially given much importance to. Now, I wish it will never end. I wish this new way of thinking could continue for me even outside prison." End of quote. So, such reflection illustrates how learning philosophy can profoundly reshape one's engagement with reality. It compels us to question and examine what we encounter, challenging us to test and reframe our structures of meaning. For Assad, accepting the alternative to prison was ultimately the obvious choice, the choice he eventually made. but what he gained through philosophical training was the ability to question the obvious and transform it into the comprehended. The epistemic outcomes of public philosophy. From what has just been considered, it becomes evident that introducing the public to philosophical thinking has not only a pedagogical or formative value, but also an epistemic one. There is, in fact, an intrinsic connection between the pedagogical and epistemic dimensions of philosophy. According to this view of the discipline, teaching philosophy is inherently an act of doing philosophy, whereby philosophical knowledge is produced in the process. It is important to clarify the nature of the epistemic goal pursued in public philosophy, as this helps us understand the relationship between public and academic philosophy. While academic research aims to advance knowledge for the broader scientific community and humanity as a whole, the epistemic gain achieved in public philosophy events primarily benefits the participants themselves. The philosophical inquiry conduced with non-professionals in contests such as Café Philo, online forum, a dialogue session with children, might appear simplistic or naive to experts. Nonetheless, it produces new knowledge for those directly involved. Through philosophical engagement, participants are led to see the object of their examination in a new light for the very first time. A learning process unfolds as they acquire new insights and a deeper awareness of how they conceive and understand the world. This is the epistemic gain of public philosophy. So far from being competition with each other or representing alternative approaches, I conceive of public and academic philosophy as two complementary missions within the same discipline. Plato's myth of the cave offers a powerful metaphor for illustrating these two paths. The professional philosopher might be linked to the individual who venture further outside the cave, achieving a new and a deeper understanding of reality. Meanwhile, the public philosopher is the one who returns to the cave to assist others in freeing themselves and embarking on their own journey of discovery. Beyond the metaphor, academic philosophy seeks to develop increasingly robust and responsive theories on the issues it addresses, aiming for a kind of universal epistemic gain. Public philosophy, on the other hand, strives to introduce others to the process of philosophical inquiry, enabling those without formal training to cultivate a metacognitive attitude. Again, quoting from Jack Russell Weinstein, he argues, and I agree with him, that while academic philosophy advances the discipline itself, public philosophy seeks to move the individual. There is, however, another aspect of the epistemic implication of public philosophy that I would like to briefly address. This aspect, while perhaps unexpected and not explicitly pursued, is no less significant. It concerns the potential impact of public philosophy on disciplinary knowledge and consequently on the advancement of philosophy itself. Today, a lively debate surrounds the concept of citizen science and citizen humanities, which are movements in which citizens actively contribute to the advancement of scientific and humanistic research. So we could ask whether public philosophy in this context be seen as a form of citizen science, as a form of citizen philosophy? In other words, does the interaction between the public and professional philosophers contribute to advancements within the discipline itself? My answer is that under certain circumstances, public engagement has the potential to enrich and enhance the discipline, allowing philosophy to evolve through its interactions with the public. Engaging with a diverse public allows professional philosophers to encounter a variety of perspectives, life histories, and experiences. People might articulate demands for meaning that differ from those anticipated by the professional philosopher. By co-philosophizing with people of varying ages and life circumstances, professional philosophers themselves stand to gain something, a broader perspective and a heightened sensitivity to aspects of reality that require problematization and deeper inquiry. Public philosophy, therefore, enables philosophers to view the world through different lenses and to consider perspectives that might otherwise have been overlooked. In some cases, it is society or a segment of it that calls on philosophers to acknowledge its needs and pressing questions. As recent literature on public philosophy attests, communities united by a shared identity, whether defined by geography, life circumstances, health conditions, or other factors, might seek out philosophers to better understand their situation, articulate their challenges, or develop stronger arguments in defense of their needs or their rights. In such instances, it is the public that, as some scholars have put it, calls us philosophers to do philosophy. Through this collaborative quest for meaning, citizens can highlight tension, challenges, and urgent questions that the academic community has either failed to notice or chosen to ignore. In this way, public philosophy can serve as a potential antidote to epistemic injustice, a term that refers to the systematic exclusion of certain groups and their perspective from meaning-making practices. By amplifying the voices of those who are often marginalized, such as children, elderly, prisoners, and others, and enabling them to engage in philosophical activity, public philosophy contributes to making the discipline epistemically more inclusive and just. In this sense, we might speak of a citizen philosophy, recognizing the potential contribution of citizens to the discipline, without undermining the value of expertise and rigorous training. This perspective acknowledges that just as professional philosophers strive to act as gadflies for the community, there are situations when the community itself may serve as a gadfly for the philosophers. The third and last outcome, the ethical and political outcome of public philosophy. There is a third expected outcome of public philosophy that I would like to address here. One even more ambitious than its pedagogical and epistemic aims, as it builds upon both. It is its potential ethical and political impact. Prominent figures of 20th century public philosophy like Matthew Liebman or Martha Nussbaum have argued that the freedom of thought cultivated by philosophy is a prerequisite for moral autonomy. They recognize that helping individuals become more self-aware and independent thinkers, regardless of their age or life and so on, carries an inherent ethical value. So for Liebman, Nussbaum, and likely the majority of public philosophers today, the dissemination of philosophical education becomes fundamentally an ethical and political endeavor. While this impact may be difficult to trace and even harder to attribute to a single initiative of public philosophy, I believe it is the principal motivation behind the work of many public philosophers. This is the ultimate goal driving their effort to make philosophical education accessible to a wider audience and underpins contemporary calls for a rediscovery of philosophy's public dimension. At its core, this endeavor seeks to empower individuals, whether children, elderly, prisoners, or any citizen, to become protagonists of their time and the reality they inhabit. What is sought today is no longer the directly political protagonism of the Athenian citizen at Socrates' time, but first and foremost an epistemic protagonism. The aim is to help contemporary citizens understand their world so that they might eventually and meaningfully engage with it. This possibility, offered to all or as many as possible, is where public philosophy assumes its profound ethical and political significance. Furthermore, we must consider the ethical and political implication of the impact that citizen involvement has on the discipline itself. How we make sense of the world, how we describe it, by acknowledging some aspects while neglecting others, always carries ethical and ultimately political consequences. Meaning making is an exercise of power, an epistemic power certainly, but one that has also ethical and political dimensions. Thus, by positing itself as an educational practice accessible to everyone and everywhere, by combating epistemic injustices, and by striving to include all voices in the process of meaning-making, public philosophy ultimately and perhaps most importantly seeks to fulfill moral obligation. I come to the conclusion. In this contribution, I have aimed to offer a systematic perspective on the phenomenon of public philosophy. Behind the diversity and heterogeneity of initiatives today identified under the common label of public philosophy, I have suggested there lies a specific conception of philosophy's function and practice. This conception regards philosophy as the pursuit of understanding reality, as a practice of problematization and sense-making, inherently metacognitive. In this light, philosophy fully embraces the Delphic motto, know yourself. From this metaphilosophical conception, I have derived the way in which philosophy can be practiced and thought. Philosophy is essentially a practical and a logical activity involving both engagement with others and an inner dialogue with oneself. Due to its deeply metacognitive nature, philosophical knowledge always requires the active involvement of the subject. Philosophy demands to be lived in the first person. For this reason, philosophy cannot be learned merely as a message to be received, but as an exercise, a practice, to be carried out together with other and through other. To the Delphic call to know yourself, philosophers have responded with the practice of synphilosophizing, co-philosophizing. This, I've argued, represents the distinct metaphilosophical feature of contemporary public philosophy in all its forms. Building on this conception, I have identified what I consider the main outcomes of public philosophy today. First, its pedagogical outcomes. Whether presented as a shared exercise or as a provocation in the public sphere, public philosophy aims to train people in the practice of philosophy, transforming how they understand and engage with reality. Second, its epistemic outcomes. On an individual level, participants gain insights into how they make sense of the world and the limits of their own understanding. On a disciplinary level, the engagement of philosophers with the public broadens philosophical horizons and helps address epistemic injustices. Finally, these outcomes have profound ethical and political relevance. At the heart of public philosophy lies the aspiration to contribute to a larger mission of philosophical education, making it accessible to those who might otherwise be excluded due to age, life circumstances, or personal conditions. We might interpret this endeavor as a form of redistribution of epistemic justice, an effort to equip everyone with the tools to address the deeply human need to make sense of their world. This ultimately is the ethical and political mission that defines public philosophy, a mission rooted in the conviction that philosophy as a shared and transformative practice belongs to everyone. Thank you.